Maybe to kick things off, we'll do a quick introduction. So Andy, we can start with you. If you can talk a little bit about yourself, an introduction, what you've been focusing on, what you've really been thinking about.
Sure thing. Kernel is an educational community. A lot of folks in Celo have been through it. We focus primarily on Socratic dialogue as a means of forming long-lasting relationships that actually provide the sorts of support that we need to move through the various different market cycles. My personal interest in education goes a long way back. I think that changes in fashion and technology that happen at these like faster pace layers in human and the more than human worlds get driven down into governance, culture, and nature primarily by education. So a lot of technical education, but found that quickly becomes outdated when you include code. And so we've been using conversation as a method of pulling people into a broader realization of what the application of these technologies could actually be, particularly given that like a lot of what we're going to talk about today is really infrastructure. And infrastructure is terribly boring unless it's linked to real live breathing people who you can connect with, who you have a sense of resonance with, who you understand and share coherent and common goals with. Celo is incredibly good at generating this kind of stuff. And you know, like we're very curious about how we can combine principled approaches to the work that we do. So for Celo started off with this idea of like unique purpose and connectedness, right, which seem to be somewhat at odds if you really think about it for a moment. But when you combine those things which seem to be opposites in conversation with people that you feel a deep resonance with, you can come to super rational ways of understanding the world, which is what really we're curious about. How can we like build games that are win-win and perhaps even more than that, which is really like a big part of ReFi. So education and how that leads to lasting relationships that then power people to make sure that they can move through market cycles and build interesting things that actually serve the common good and do so in a long-term way, right? Because we're here as friends for life rather than as people just looking to make a quick profit in the next cycle.
Maybe, yes, and if you can give an introduction on yourself, what you've been really focusing on at Giveth and maybe even outside of Giveth.
Yeah, I'm Griff Green. I've been a serial crypto nonprofit founder for like, I don't know, since 2016. And I founded Giveth, DAppNode, Common Stack, General Magic, and I don't know, a bunch of others. And it's all along really a lot of the stuff that Andy just said. Like, how do we build economic games that can produce real value for society? And kind of, I really have been just blown away by, like, from the early days, Bitcoin's ability to create public infrastructure and create things that, like, you know, Rails for global finance is a public good. And it's really valuable. And they did this without taxes, without donations. They did it through economic games. And how do we take, you know, I've just been focused pretty much the whole time on how do we take this this model, this opportunity to do something different than how we've collaborated around social good for society. How do we take this model from Bitcoin and apply it to, you know, helping the environment, helping the homeless, building roads, things that we rely on taxes and donations to do. And that's where I spend all of my time.
Let's talk about that model. You can clap. So let's actually talk about that model and creating that new model. So I'm sure a lot of folks here are thinking about ReFi. The state of ReFi today, when we think of ReFi, regenerative finance, and from there actually building out a full regenerative economy, where do you kind of see the current state of ReFi? What are the core pillars? Because I think every conversation I have with someone, people define ReFi differently. And so I'm curious on how you define ReFi. And by defining ReFi, how do you envision kind of that state of building out towards a more regenerative economic system?
Yeah, that's a good question. The principled approach to thinking about things always goes back to first principles. I think that's like at a very, very like broad overview, one of the most interesting ways of thinking about regeneration in general is those systems which put value into the hands of people who are actually closest to the problems and who are therefore capable of solving them in the most direct and immediate fashion. This is a long line of thinking through even Illich and Michael Polanyi, James Dewey, John Dewey, like lots of different people have thought about this in terms of saying like really what like decentralized governance or networks are really good at doing is enabling people on the edges of the networks who are actually closest to the problems and therefore who have the local context required to come up with the most simple, elegant, and effective solutions to do so in an immediate fashion without needing to appeal to authority back in the center of the network. So regenerative finance is any kind of system that puts value into the hands of people actually capable of solving the problems, where capacity is largely defined by their closeness to the consequences of any given negative effect. One of the things that leads me to in terms of thinking about like what does regenerative finance actually look like in a practical sense is something like order flow auctions and MEV share in Ethereum is like a really, really practical, grounded, encoded, and operational example of these kind of regenerative loops that actually results in pro-social effects for the people who use systems. So in the current financial system, you guys will remember with the GameStop debacle and Robinhood, that one of the most valuable pieces of information that we can generate, and which is generally generated without your knowledge and certainly without your ability to leverage it for your own benefits, is something called profit from order flow, right? PFOF. And this is, as I say, enormously boring unless you know the people who are actually doing it and like connected and resonating with them in terms of the effect that this really rather niche and otherwise boring stuff has on the like money and holdings that you have, the ability that you have to enact change in the world, because that's ultimately what value allows us to do. With like MEVShare, which is built by Flashbots and who began thinking about like what maximum extractable value actually is in the current financial system, maximum extractable value goes to the people in positions of privilege and power who already have the money and connections required to extract that for their own benefits. And instead of doing that, we build systems that transparently and verifiably encode rules that ensure that that there are no people in positions of privilege and power, that the way the system functions is clear, transparent, and allows for the participating people to benefit from the like net maximum extractable value that exists in systems. I know it's like a little bit of an abstract concept, but like essentially what happens in MEVShare is that like there's all of this value that you can extract from what is traditionally known as profit from order flow. Bidders extract that value, but then pay the bid that they made for that block back to the users from whom they extracted it. So the actual like encoded implementation is like extract the value and then pay it back to the users. But the net effect for the users who like all of us who use like Flashbots protect RPC, or if you like run your own MEV boost stuff these days, you're participating in this, and the net effect for users is that they get to participate in much more complicated auctions that are much more game theoretically like beneficial to all participants, and you don't need to know any of the stuff that I've just said. You just get to like call an RPC or run MEV boost, and you're participating in a game theoretically stable and beneficial and pro-social auction that could never be encoded directly on chain, but that is like a net benefit for all of us, right? And that to me is like enormously exciting and like an incredible like infrastructural level change to how finance works. No longer is PFOF the unique domain of massive hedge funds and other people who have the particular power and privilege to leverage that kind of data for their own ever expanding profits. It is now a domain that is necessarily accessible to all people. So just as like Bitcoin introduced all of us to like the difference between a market and a limit order, which is a piece of financial knowledge that like nobody was ever really like aware of unless you worked in the banking industry, right? Now all of a sudden that kind of thing is beginning to flow into these, again, like what seem to be niche and like rather boring technical topics, but actually is where like power is enacted and like value is created and distributed in the world. So those are the places like I'm most excited about. I think there's like lots more in climates and MRV and at the application layer, all of which I think necessarily depend upon this kind of like protocol level mechanism that is really thinking about like, what do these like very, very boring kinds of regeneration actually look like? Can we get the people with the right kind of hearts and the right kind of expertise in place, making sure that these things operate in a public and verifiable way, such that all of the other great stuff that we can do with climates, with social, with various other applications can come into play.
Yeah, I mean, just on top of that, I mean, I don't think I can do a better job at defining ReFi as you did at the beginning, so I'm not even going to try. But one of the other cool things with this like infrastructure, you know, normally we really rely on governments to provide public infrastructure, but now it's like open source, you know, and competitive. And so like Celo's launching in L2, and Gitcoin is launching in L2, and Mantle is launching in L2, and guess what? You get to opt in to whichever L2 you want to participate on. And then you get to decide kind of where your, you know, what did you call it? PFOF? The MEV, wherever your like transaction fees are going, you kind of get to decide. You know, and what's really exciting for me in the ReFi space is that we're almost creating a system that's better than governments for providing public goods. We're not there yet, okay, not even close. And we probably won't be there very soon. But slowly but surely, we're creating competitive markets that are sending value towards public goods, towards social good, towards things that are actually just making the world a better place. But we're not doing it with taxes, really. We're doing it with opt-in voluntary choices. People want to participate in this economy, in this market. And so then they choose to participate, and that marketplace already has kind of algorithmic built-in funding streams that are making the world a better place in one way or another. And you get to choose that. Whereas with taxes, they're kind of mandatory. There's no choice here. It's either like, you know, if you want to participate in the market in this general region, well, here are the rules. Go get a license and, you know, pay these taxes and da-da-da. It's not really an option, you know. And of course, you know, it's not like it's a good or bad thing. Governments are the best way of funding public goods right now. Whether we like it or not, that is just the case. But I think that if ReFi succeeds and really does its thing, there will be a day where people have a revolution, and instead of replacing the government with another government, they replace it with a competitive market of ReFi organizations. And that's when ReFi succeeds.
So we dove into actually, you know, at the protocol level, right? You're saying build out infrastructure, regenerative infrastructure. And upon that, you can build different types of applications and different use cases. I'm curious to know in your thought on this, right? Like we can take, you know, the traditional financial system has all the flaws that we don't need to go into. Can you have a regenerative structure if you have kind of what you talked about from like at a protocol level? But if you have applications that are sitting on top of it that aren't regenerative, how do you navigate that? For example, take, you know, you can have a protocol, you can have like your MEV share, all those kinds of things. But if you're then having a protocol that sits on top, that's basically, you know, funding like the destruction of rainforests. How do you kind of coincide the two things? Or is it that simply by the fact that you're building protocols at the infrastructure level, that in and of itself should start changing what's then built on top?
Can I jump in on this? I don't think anyone's trying to just destroy rainforest, you know?
Yeah.
But there is competing value in society, right? If somebody is going into the rainforest and harvesting, you know, life-saving cures, and they, you know, need to extract a little bit from the rainforest to do it, you know, you kind of are like, well, you know, the net benefit ends up paying off, right? And this is what in a dream world society would be constantly balancing. The value of private goods, you know, which is like individual benefit, which business models are extremely good at providing, where it's like, okay, you know, there's a scarce resource, so let's, you know, like create a marketplace around the scarce resource and trade it around. And maybe you have a factory that's producing this scarce resource as effectively as possible, but it pollutes a little bit. So how do we mitigate the pollution while producing this value for individuals? But we don't have something on the other side balancing the, hey, like we need to keep the river clean or protect the Amazon, and we are producing this value. That's the misbalance. The imbalance is that there is clear revenue streams and profit opportunities in the individual private goods space, but there isn't this there are very crappy, inadequate methods of creating value in the public goods space. And so the private goods space, the business models, exploit the public goods space, whether it's the environment or even social welfare, so that they can get their profit models. And what we have instead is, I would say, we have governments actually taxing those marketplaces to effectively extract value from those marketplaces to protect the environment. But government's coordination methods are so horrible compared to the free market methods, right? So if we could actually create a better coordination system on this side, we might be able to find balance.
Yeah, it's a curious question, right? I think that, for me, one of the things that it comes down to is this notion of credible neutrality, which is really difficult to fully absorb, right? Because what it means in a day-to-day practical sense for people who build infrastructure or who even build applications is that the goal is not to do something good, right? That's one of the net results of thinking about credible neutrality as it applies to the mechanisms that large amounts of people use for the creation and distribution of value, is letting go of what you think of as good. And this is not to say that you shouldn't behave in discerning ways about the nature of the things that you build or interact with. It's just that the gold standard for what these mechanisms really look like is those that do not impose any particular dogmatic perspective on anybody else. We've been doing this for thousands of years, right? People who thought that they were doing good and who looked very similar to me. I come from South Africa. There were many, many people who looked exactly like I do, who thought that they were doing good for the majority of my country's history, and they wrecked the place, right? And the most surprising thing is that nobody thought that they were evil, right? And it's a very important historical lesson to learn, because the most important thing that we can do when creating this kind of stuff is credibly neutral systems that allow people to express their own value preferences. And it's very, very difficult to do that, because it raises all sorts of moral questions. This is not a final solution, right? The way that Kernel works, and you would have seen it in my rambling response, which was not an answer, is that we don't offer answers, right? The only thing that we're looking for is an education system that thinks about what it means to do education in a peer-to-peer manner in an interconnected world, is that we look for consistently better questions, which is what credibly neutral systems offer us, right? They're just what is it that you really want? What is it that you really value? How do you come to what it is that is really valuable in the world? How do you express and represent that in relationship with other people? Right? Those are the things that we actually care about. And nobody has answers to them. And if they do have answers, you should run very far away, because they're probably going to reduce the possible sets of emergent behavior that could possibly come into existence. So I think that striving for credibly neutral protocols and credibly neutral applications built on top of them is the best thing that informed and educated people can do about it. Does this mean that everything that people build is going to be wonderful? Absolutely not. Clearly, the history of crypto is proof of that, right? Not just crypto, but especially the last 12 years has been this kind of thing. And that's not any kind of discouragement, I think. It's a call to a recognition of what the actual work is that we're doing here, which is, if anything, intergenerational, right? The effects of the financial system under which we live, which are not all bad, right, have been felt for more than 500 years, right? This way of ordering value and representing it through a particular kind of money in the world is a very, very long-run thing. And so the work that we do here it extends much beyond the people in this room and much beyond a single human lifespan. And you can't know what good is for you here and today, you definitely can't know what's good for you, like your antecedents, right? The people still to come 7 generations from now. But we can think about building open and permissionless systems that are credibly neutral, that will allow them to express their own values. And like what those values are, who knows? Perhaps they do want to destroy the rainforests, but like it's their choice, right? And I think that that's like primarily like the underlying philosophy of these lot of things, is that like we have to be able to let people express their own choices, because what that ultimately comes down to is like, do you trust one another, right? Like Bitcoin, Ethereum, Celo, these things, they were never trustless, right? What they give us is decentralized trust. And there is a radical difference between those two things. It's not just semantics, right? Like there's a big, big difference between a trustless system and something that offers you decentralized trust, and decentralized trust across time. And that's what I think we have, right? And I think that like what we're really asking is like, do we trust one another? Do we trust one another across time to build good stuff? And like, some people will break that trust, right? That's the nature of the thing. But is the system robust and resilient enough to absorb those breaks of trust in ways which it hasn't been before, such that we can genuinely like move iteratively towards like a better world, a world in which it's more possible to love wisely, right? That's ultimately for me, like regeneration in the wider sense. It's just like, how do I love you well, right? That's a lovely question. I wish I had the answer, but it's nice to kind of like live with that, you know?
The credibly neutral point is actually a good one, right? And it's something you strive for. It's not necessarily something you'll automatically say, oh, I know exactly how to get to it. And then from a protocol standpoint, when you think of how protocols are built, it's thinking around how you have shared consensus around what might be something that in that journey for credibly neutral. And so in my mind, that requires kind of this aspect of, can you build a community that is thinking about this, that's participating in that journey in the best of intentions? And I think both of you have kind of worked a good bit on that, on how do you kind of create that type of community who is asking those questions and saying, what is this journey for understanding what we can do from a best effort, and continuing to iterate on that. So when you guys have both looked at building community for this, for different pieces of this, what are those kind of core facets? How do you think about building community and saying, here are core questions that we need to understand, or at least seek to understand?
I mean, building community is, that's a challenge, always a challenge. I think the most important thing is have clear mission, vision, values going in. And if you really want to go the next mile, once you've built a little bit of community, revisiting those and getting the community involved in it to make sure that it fits the people, the core team that's kind of come around it. Communities are ever evolving, and as long as you have like a clear mission as like a founder or a initiator of one of these organizations, then with just follow the values, and maintain the values, and of course maintain attention and appreciate people's attention, because that's the real resource of a community. It's the whole people actually putting their mind's eye on what you are trying to create in this world. Building these communities is really difficult, especially in the bear market when numbered go up is not even an option almost. So it's really hard work, and especially when your infrastructure is almost unintelligible. A lot of times when I talk to people about what I do, for instance, and especially when everyone hates crypto, like right now, just leave out the crypto stuff, right? Because I feel like in crypto communities, sometimes it makes sense. Like during the bull markets, it's like, yeah, I work in crypto. Oh, crypto's hot right now. Okay, cool, right? But most of the time, especially in this room, is what we are building, does that really have anything to do with crypto? Like it does, of course, but that's not the story. And that's definitely not the story that's going to ring true to people today, right? Like Giveth is a crowdfunding platform that helps charities raise money. I don't have to mention crypto, It's not even in some ways, it's very integral to the end goal, and that's why we're in this space. But it's not what we do; it's how we do it, and it's definitely not why we do it. And so I feel like, especially in the Celo community, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who are already taking this stance, where if you're trying to build a community, the crypto side of it is like, it's an interesting piece, but it shouldn't be the why, right? And it shouldn't be the attractor, because otherwise you'll get the wrong kind of community.
I'm going to take an alternative stance here, which is that don't build community, it's a trap. It's not the right way to think about this kind of stuff. It's inevitably self-recursive and navel-gazing. If you set out to build community, you end up where Griff and I did with the DAO way back when, where it was like, we're going to build a governance community to govern one another, and we'll talk about governance. And then we'll have like governance meetings where we talk about governance and the previous ways that we thought we might govern each other, which turned out not to be so well thought out, and maybe we'll like find new. It never really like has enough external momentum to result in like meaningful, coherent relationships over the long term, particularly when there are exogenous shocks to the system. So like the alternative way of thinking about this is be like 100% clear about like what your mission and purpose is in the world. And if a community gathers around that, it's a wonderful success metric. It's a terrible design goal, right? So that like don't like set out to build community, right? Like set out to do the thing that you are uniquely talented and gifted to do in this world. And if other people happen to gather around that, you know you're doing a good job, right? Like that's the way to think about this kind of stuff in a like coherent and genuinely pro-social fashion, right? Like John Dewey, the guy who came up with the Dewey Decimal System and who was an incredible American philosopher and who wrote a book called The Public and Its Problems, which is like just one of the best books.
My undergrad thesis was actually on that, so that's cool.
Oh, incredible. Okay, fantastic. Well, then I'm definitely going to embarrass myself. But the point here being that, like, really what you're looking for is ways of making the groups of people who are affected by the consequences of decisions of those in power capable of expressing themselves, coming to their own identity, and deliberating on potential solutions to those problems in clear and coherent communication channels, right? So really, like, what you're looking for in gathering groups of people around any particular problem is a clear and definitive statement about what that problem is, the consequences that it has in our lived experience. This is why the people who are closest to problems are always those best positioned to come up with the simplest and elegant solutions. And then allowing them to communicate through effective channels, which almost always means money. It always almost means value, right? Like, put your money where your mouth is like one colloquial way of saying this. You really want to enable those people to communicate effectively, which is to put value at stake behind the things that they value, behind the things that they care about. And it's that kind of thing which actually seems to generate like long-lasting community around like particular sets of problems, right? Like the Ethereum community is a very interesting case study in this regard because it's a constantly amorphous, changing thing, and yet we give it one signifier. It's the Ethereum community. Griff and I have kind of like wandered in and out of that community in various different ways for a long time now, right? And it's never the same people, but it's always the same thing. And that's curious, right? Because like when you're setting out to build community, it's like, oh no, there's like the same old enclosure act, which always destroys the commons. This is how the lords did it in England. They enclosed the public lands. And if you think that it's your community, if you talk about it in the sense of something that you possess, you have already drawn a fence around this group of people. Be like, oh no, this is like the Giveth crowd, and like you're not allowed to talk to the Giveth crowd, and like definitely don't come and like tell us about like other public good stuff that's happening. That's not how you want community to be. You want it to be like porous. You want it to be able to permeable, right? And like, because like we're all affected by like consequences in overlapping ways that require very particular kinds of communication. I think that like being clear about like what the problem, what the purpose, what the mission is, and then doing that and seeing if people gather around it is a much more like effective way, because like everybody here knows what problems they face on a daily basis. you can come up with like a mission to solve that. And if people gather around it, like you know that this is a worthy thing to work on. And if they don't, that's wonderful feedback too. Like go and work on any one of the other 100 problems that you inevitably face in your life, because like life isn't easy, right? We all have lots of problems. Or maybe I'm just revealing too much about myself.
So we're at time. Thank you so much for speaking. I think that was actually really illuminating. So thank you.
Thanks, man.